Note, Rotorway International has two designs of the fan pulley assembly. Be sure to identify for the parts department on which bearing you will need. For bearing replacement, do the following. Before removing the fan from the hub, make an index mark on the fan and the hub. Remove the lower snap ring on the secondary shaft. It will be necessary to use a puller, as the pulley was finally installed to the shaft using Loctite. Important, inspect the secondary shaft for any sign of wear or damage from the fan pulley bearing. Call customer service if you suspect shaft damage. Remove the two snap rings on each side of the bearing. Heat the pulley in an oven at 250 to 275 degrees Fahrenheit. Lightly press out the old bearing with a press. When replacing the bearing, be sure the extended end or the end with the two set screws is properly positioned as shown. Clean the pulley's inner surface with acetone and then clean the new bearing. Insert the snap ring into the pulley groove and make sure it is seated. Again, reheat the pulley to 250 to 270 degrees Fahrenheit. The bearing should drop into place or lightly press into position if necessary until bearing contacts and sits against the snap ring. Replace the second snap ring in the pulley and let air cool. Deburr the snap ring groove on the secondary shaft. Check for close tolerance fit of the fan pulley bearing against the secondary shaft. Note, use Loctite 609 upon final assembly of this part to the secondary shaft assembly. At the 500-hour service, the main drive belts, along with the alternator water pump and the upper and lower fan drive belts, need to be changed out. Changing the alternator belt and upper fan drive belt requires removal of the secondary from the square tubes of the airframe. Before removing the secondary, remove the rear oil bath seal as shown in the 100-hour maintenance video series, Tape 2. Note the oil bath's lower pan has been removed during this portion of the video for a better view of this procedure. Refer to the instructions accompanying the new main drive belts and prepare them for installation. Be sure and clean the belts thoroughly before installation. Loosen the belts of the alternator and fan drive. Remove the fan countershaft drive assembly from the airframe. Remove the lock nuts of the secondary's lower bearing flange. Remove the bolts that secure the flange to the frame, keeping the shims and the flange together. Remove the bolts of the upper bearing assembly and remove the secondary from the airframe. Keep the shims together. Note, it is very important, maintain the order and number of shims for the bearing assemblies. Inspect the condition of the secondary pulley. Clean any grease and dirt from the top surface of the upper bearing. Replace the bearing temperature strip if faded or damaged from moisture and age. Warning, do not tamper with secondary unit. This is a factory serviceable unit only. Replace the lower secondary bearing assembly. Replace the fan drive shaft bearings. Replace the idler pulley bearing. Heat the idler pulley bearing in an oven, as demonstrated with other bearing replacement procedures. After new bearing installation, always verify that the bearing was installed correctly by rotating the pulley or bearing on the shaft and check that it turns smooth and its alignment is correct. The lower main shaft bearing, RCO, is 500 hours. Also, these 4 1/4 inch bolts and the lock nuts need to be replaced at the 500-hour service interval. To replace the 1/4 inch bolts on the main sprocket, it may be possible to raise the sprocket up the shaft to access the bolt heads as shown. To replace the lower main bearing, refer to the steps shown next during the main shaft raising or removal procedures. Note, it is not necessary to raise or remove the shaft to change the lower bearing. Should you find it necessary, It is also possible to raise or remove the main shaft without disturbing the rigging of the swash plate. Proceed as follows. Level the main shaft fore and aft, using blocks of wood under the skids. Then use a hoist to support the weight of the shaft before servicing the lower main shaft bearing. Adjust so there is a slight lifting tension. Loosen the four 3/8" bolts securing the main thrust bearing flanges to the hood bracket, approximately 1 full turn. Remove the safety spacer and clean the grease from the shaft. Loosen the set screw on the main thrust bearing lock ring and knock the ring loose from the bearing. Deburr the shaft. Make absolutely sure there are no marks or burrs on the shaft. Any burrs could damage the main thrust bearing, or the shaft could jam the bearing, making removal virtually impossible. Cut the safety wire and remove the 3/8" bolts. Before removing the last bolt, make an index mark on the hub and the shaft. Loosen the set screw on the lower shaft lock ring and knock the ring loose from the bearing end shaft. Remove the nuts and lock washers from the lower bearing flanges. Remove the bolts that secure the bearing flange and the upper engine mount to the airframe. Allow the shaft and bearing assembly to move away from the airframe slightly to remove the lower flange. Deburr the shaft and clean it with acetone. Now lower the main shaft assembly to move the bearing down and away from the oil bath. Install a puller and apply pressure to the bearing. Because of the Loctite 609 used on final assembly, it will be necessary to use heat to free the bearing from the shaft. Use caution when applying heat. Only heat the inner race of the bearing. Do not apply heat directly to the shaft. Clean the shaft with acetone. Before reinstalling the lower bearing assembly, raise or remove the main rotor shaft from the helicopter. This is necessary to access the 1/4 inch bolts on the main sprocket. Loosen the main shaft clevis lock ring and wedge a screwdriver tip in the split. This will allow the shaft to pass through easily. Remove the bolt holding the rod end of the counterbalance scissors clevis. Cut the lower wire tie securing the rubber boot to the shaft. The main rotor shaft is now ready to be raised or removed. It will pass through the swash plate assembly, making it unnecessary to disturb the rigging of the cyclic and collective. These 4 bolts and lock nuts in the large sprocket need to be replaced. The bolts part number E00-2450 and lock nuts E00-3410 are included in the 500-hour service kit. Cut the safety wire and remove and replace 1 bolt at a time. Carefully inspect each bolt and bolt hole for any signs of wear. Remember, these bolts should have a tight fit. If the new bolts go in too easily or there are some other indications of wear, contact Rotorway customer service. Retorque the bolts to 7 foot-pounds. Use the same number of washers under the nuts as the original bolts, making sure the lock nuts do not bottom out on the threads. Safety wire the bolt heads to the sprocket before reinstalling the shaft. Inspect and clean the main rotor shaft before reinstalling. Inspect the boot and replace if necessary. Inspect and clean the main thrust bearing. Replace if necessary. Note the 500-hour service requires the teeter block bearings be changed out in addition to the 3/4 inch main drive pin and shim kit. Refer to the Rotor Hub 100-hour service in the Maintenance Video Series Tape 3 for these inspections and disassembly procedures. While the main rotor shaft is out of the helicopter, you might find it easier to service the Rotor Hub for the 100, 250, and 500-hour RCO parts. Remove the grease fittings. Heat the teeter blocks in an oven set at 275 degrees. Use a press to remove the bearings. Clean the teeter blocks with acetone. Heat the teeter blocks again to 275 degrees. Apply Loctite 609 to the new bearing. Use a 5/1000 piece of shim stock or a tool with 5/1000 rise as shown to press the bearing within 5/1000 of the machined or the inside face of teeter block. Do not allow the bearing to be flush against the surface of the teeter block. Reinstall the main shaft and rotor hub, reversing the removal procedure shown earlier. Reinstall the sprocket hub bolts and torque. Safety wire the bolt heads to each other. Safety wire the shanks of the 3/8" bolts to each other. Finally, install the lower bearing to the shaft with Loctite 609 and allow to set. Then set the upper and lower lock rings to the bearings as shown in the construction manual and video. Follow the installation procedures in the construction manual and video, beginning with the Section 11 drive system for the reinstallation of the secondary unit and the other components. Reinstall the engine as shown in the construction manual and video, Section 12. Follow the new belt tensioning procedure shown in the construction manual and video. After performing the 500-hour service on your helicopter, it is a good and safe practice to perform an inspection similar to the new aircraft inspection. Using the same checklist to verify and check all of the alignments and riggings will allow you to double-check everything. It is also a good practice to tie the helicopter down for its first run-ups after servicing the main rotor blades, hub, and swash plate. This concludes the 500-hour service. Remember to include the 25, 50, 100, and 250-hour service procedures with a 500-hour interval. Note the following maintenance items are to be performed every 1,000 hours. In addition to the 1,000-hour parts, you will need the 500-hour service kit, which includes all the parts for 100 and 250-hour recommended changeouts. Call the Rotorway Parts Department for more information. Because of the number of inspections and part changes at the 1,000-hour service, you may find it easier to remove all the body panels, windscreen, and the tub. The RI-162F engine at 1,000 hours requires a complete engine overhaul. This is a critical and complex task. It is recommended that this service be performed only by the Rotorway Service Center and not by anyone else, even if they are familiar with all the aspects of internal engine overhaul. However, specifications have been given to perform this service, and all the necessary parts are available from the factory. Call Rotorway Customer Service for more information. To remove the engine for the 1,000-hour overhaul, proceed as follows. Disconnect the leads from the battery terminal. Remove the heat shielding. Remove or support the tail boom. Drain the coolant from the system. Drain the oil from the engine and sump. Remove the muffler and tailpipe. Remove the radiator and fan shroud. Index the fan to the hub and remove the 4 bolts that hold the fan to the hub. Remove the tail boom support braces. Loosen the top engine mount bolts. Loosen the all-thread bolt on the upper engine mount clevis to release the tension on the drive belts. Remove the clutch tube weldment and idler pulley. Remove the exhaust manifold assembly. Disconnect all of the fuel lines and cap them to prevent contamination. Disconnect the oil lines and cap them. Disconnect all the coolant lines and cap them. Disconnect all electrical and FADEC connectors from the engine. Disconnect the manifold pressure tubes from the intake manifold. Disconnect the throttle cable from the intake manifold. Disconnect the spark plug wires. Remove the bolt that fastens the torque link to the engine. Use a jack to support the weight of the engine. With jack in place, remove the three 5/16" bolts from the lower engine mount and carefully lower the engine out and away from the airframe. Plug or cover all of the ports and use your original engine shipping crate to ship the engine back to Rotorway. Call Rotorway's customer service for more information and scheduling services. After service, reinstall the engine as per the construction manual and video section 12. The spark plug wires need to be replaced at 1,000-hour service interval. Note, only use spark plug wires from Rotorway International. Do not substitute with any other spark plug wires. Follow the instructions in the construction manual and video for spark plug wire installation. The engine pulley is on condition or an RCO of 1,000 hours and can be replaced by Rotorway during the engine overhaul. The 5/16" male rod end of the torque link must be changed at the 1,000-hour service interval. The 1,000-hour service requires change-out of the following tail rotor parts. They are the carriage slider assembly E17-6125, the male rod ends E17-1210, and the female rod end E16-1200. Refer to the 250 and 500-hour tail rotor procedures and include these parts as you perform the service. The cross-shaft bushing of all the helicopter's control assemblies must be checked for their proper end play. The bushings are RCO at 2,000 hours and must be inspected at the 1,000-hour service interval. If you find the nylon bushing and aluminum bushing have too much end play or the parts seem to be binding, disassemble and replace the parts. The 1,000-hour service requires the following parts to be changed in the directional control assembly. The 3/16" female rod end of the directional cable and the 1/4" male and female rod ends of the directional scissors are to be replaced at the 1,000-hour service interval. Remove the 3/16" bolt, securing the rod end to the scissors, and loosen the jam nut. Then count the number of turns to remove and install the new rod end with the same number of turns. Tighten the locking nut, replace the bolt, and verify the cable travel. Remove the bolts to remove both rod ends. Using calipers, measure and note the distance. Replace the new rod end with the same measurement. Remove the scissors mount bushing by removing the bolt. Lower the bushing away from the scissors beam. The scissors mount bushing is RCO at 2,000 hours. Check for proper end play. Clean, grease lightly, and reassemble. Refer to the construction manual and video section 10 for detailed procedures. Check for proper end play of the male rod ends of the cyclic control assembly. Note these rod ends have a 2,000 hour RCO and must be inspected at 1,000 hours. If there is any noticeable wear, the rod end must be replaced. Check the cyclic's lateral nylon pivot bushing. Remove the bolt and the two large fender washers. Replace a small amount of grease, Mystic JT6, on the bolt, bushing, and mating surfaces. Reinstall the bolt and 2 fender washers. Remember, this bolt has a tight fit. Tighten the bolt enough to hold firmly while still allowing the cyclic clevis to move easily without any end play. Caution, under no conditions should any grease or lubricant be used on the sliding inner cable of the cyclic's control. Note, the male rod ends of the collective control rod are 2000 hour RCO. However, if you need to replace the rod ends on condition, follow this procedure to maintain the proper rigging. Unhook the spring. Remove the bolt that holds the rod end to the collective actuator fork. Remove and inspect the rod end spacers and spring bracket for wear and corrosion. Remove bolt from the G control arm. Remove the collective control rod from the helicopter. Before removing, measure the distance between the rod ends and remove the old rod ends from the collective control rod, counting the number of turns it takes to remove them. Reinstall the new rod ends using the same number of turns, then confirm this position with the original measurement. Reconnect the lower rod end first and torque the bolt. Then reassemble the spring bracket, rod end spacers, and rod end to the hole in the actuator fork. Torque the bolt. Make sure rod end lock nuts are firmly in place. Reconfirm collective pitch setting by reviewing collective rigging procedures in the Construction Manual and Video Section 25. Inspect and verify the operation of the throttle shaft assembly. The rod ends are RCO'd at 2,000 hours or on condition. Replace as necessary. When reinstalling the throttle shaft, lightly grease the shaft where the nylon bushing makes contact. Reinstall the washer and the B control arm in their respective positions. Reinstall the bolt in the control arm casting and torque. Note, when replacing the grip, do not cut off any length of the rubber grip. The part of the grip that extends past the throttle shaft handle and onto the non-rotating parts of the collective stick will help act as a friction lock for the throttle. Rotorway International has used two types of steel-braided hoses for the Exec 162F helicopter. The earlier models incorporated a rubber-lined steel-braided hose assemblies for the fuel system. They usually did not have a part number tag and were a larger size outside diameter. The later models used a Teflon-lined steel-braided hose assemblies. These hoses have a tag which identifies the Rotorway part number and TSO information. They are usually smaller in outside diameter. It is important to note that the recommended changeout times are different. The rubber-lined hoses are on condition, 1,000 hour or 5 years. The Teflon-lined hoses are on condition or 2,000 hour. After initial installation and use, the Teflon-lined fuel hoses have a tendency to set. Never attempt to straighten or reconfigure a set hose, as it will crack. The two fuel pumps are to be replaced at the 1,000 hour service interval. Reference the construction manual and construction video, section 20, for installation instructions. The fuel pressure regulator is RCO'd at 1,000 hours. The fuel injectors are to be replaced at the 1,000 hour service. This can be included in the engine overhaul. However, should you detect a problem with an injector or need to replace one before the engine overhaul, follow these procedures. Normally, there is no maintenance required on the fuel injectors. Note, the primary and secondary injectors of the Exec 162F helicopter have different internal resistances and flow different amounts of fuel. Use an ohm meter to measure the resistance between the two terminals of the injector. Compare this value against the injector's specified resistance located in the engine manual. Rotorway recommends replacing an injector if the resistance reading is incorrect and you suspect that it is not properly delivering fuel. Comprehensive testing and cleaning of the injectors can only be accomplished using special equipment. The flow rate and spray pattern must be measured and analyzed to determine if the injector is performing according to specifications. To remove the fuel injector, proceed as follows. Carefully bleed off the fuel pressure and drain the fuel from the fuel rail assembly. Disconnect both fuel lines from the fuel rail and remove the retention bolts. Withdraw the parts collectively by moving them from side to side while pulling the injectors out of the intake manifold or the plenum if removing the secondary injectors. Carefully remove the injectors from the fuel rail with the same wiggling motion. If an injector is being reused, the O-rings must be replaced. These bores must have a good finish and be free of scratches. Before installing the injectors, apply a light film of engine oil to the O-rings and to the bores into which the injectors will be inserted. Install both injectors into the fuel rail by pushing them into the bores while wiggling them from side to side. Install this assembly into the appropriate plenum or intake manifold bores using the same wiggling motion. Install and lightly snug the retention bolts. The fuel rail bolt holes are large enough to allow adjustment of the final mounting position. The alignment of the injectors must not be binding. Once this alignment is correct, torque the bolts. Safety wire the bolts in the primary injectors. Reconnect the fuel lines and perform a pressure check to test for leaks. As with the fuel system, Rotorway International has used two types of steel-braided hoses for the Exec 162F helicopter. The earlier models incorporated a rubber-lined steel-braided hose assemblies for the oil system. They usually did not have a part number tag and were a larger size outside diameter. The later models used a Teflon-lined steel-braided hose assemblies. These hoses have a tag which identifies the Rotorway part number and TSO information. They are usually smaller in outside diameter. It is important to note that the recommended change-out times are different. The rubber-lined hoses are on condition, 1,000 hour or 5 years. The Teflon-lined hoses are on condition or 2,000 hour. The springs on the exhaust knuckle must be replaced at 1,000 hours. The secondary assembly of the drivetrain will need to be removed from the helicopter and returned to Rotorway Service Center for 1,000-hour service. Refer to the 500-hour service interval for secondary removal procedures. The 1,000-hour service interval requires inspection and servicing the upper bearing assembly and shaft. Call Rotorway Customer Service for more information and scheduling. The rotor hub components that must be replaced at 1,000-hour RCO are the rotor hub plate, teeter block assemblies, thin washers, rod ends, and pitch links. At 1,000 hours, the swash plate assembly should be returned to Rotorway for service. The collective slider ball, spherical bushing, and slider ball O-ring are factory serviceable items and need to be replaced. Contact Rotorway Customer Service Center for information regarding the factory service of rotor hub and swash plate assembly. The main shaft is an on-condition or 1,000-hour RCO. For the 1,000-hour service, you will also need to replace the following components: the main sprocket hub, main thrust bearing and flange, and main safety spacer. To service the rotor hub, swash plate, and the main rotor shaft, remove the assembly from the helicopter. Loosen the 4 bearing flange bolts 1 full turn. Disconnect the cyclic and collective control assemblies from the main shaft assembly. Remove the bolts that hold the collective actuator fork to the hood bracket. Remove the safety spacer from the main shaft. Loosen the set screw on the main thrust bearing lock ring. Knock the lock ring loose with a hammer and punch. Note, make sure and file the upper lock ring burrs and check for any other burrs on the shaft before attempting to raise the main shaft through the main thrust bearing. Do the same to the lower bearing lock ring. Remove the lower main shaft bearing. Remove the burrs before pulling the bearing from the shaft. This bearing and shaft use Loctite during the final construction procedures. It will be necessary to use a puller and some heat to break the bearing free of the shaft. Remove safety wire and the 3 main sprocket bolts. Be sure the sprocket hub turns freely on the shaft. Level the skids of the helicopter, then position a hoist to lift the assembly from the helicopter. The builder, owner, can return the main rotor shaft assembly in its original crate to Rotorway International for factory service. They will provide a new shaft, hub plate, teeter blocks, and hardware with the shaft centered and shimmed to the hub plate while servicing the swash plate assembly. As an option, the swash plate can be removed from the main rotor shaft assembly for factory service by Rotorway. Fabricate a wood frame to assist holding the main shaft assembly, inverted as shown. Measure the distance from the shoulder of the end of the shaft to the bottom of the slider ring clamp. It should measure approximately 18 7/8 inches. Loosen the bolt on the slider lock ring. Remove the bolt that holds the male rod end of the counterweight to the swash plate. Cut the lower wire tie to free the boot from the swash plate assembly. Carefully slide the swash plate assembly off the shaft. Cut the upper wire tie of the boot and slide the boot off the shaft. Measure the distance from the shoulder to the shaft knuckle to the top of the counterweight. It should measure approximately 6 7/8 inches. Loosen the bolt locking the counterweight to the shaft. Lightly tap a flat blade screwdriver in the split of the counterweight and slide it off the shaft. The master and slave thrust blocks are RCO'd at 2,000 hour or on condition. When ordering the new shaft and rotor hub parts, call Rotorway's customer service for more information regarding the matching of your thrust blocks to the new hub plate. The elastomeric bearings are in on condition or replaced every 10 years. If you are replacing parts and reassembling the rotor hub assembly, refer to the rotor hub inspection and rotor hub shimming procedures in the Maintenance Video Series 100-hour rotor hub section. The 9/16" bolt, 9/16" nut, aligner block assembly, and aligner block bolts must be replaced at 1,000 hours. Reference the construction manual, prints, and construction video, section 24, for installation procedures. The Rotorway International manufactured rotor blades have a RCO of 1,500 hours or are changed on condition. Refer to the 25-hour service section of the Maintenance Video Series regarding inspection and blade fatigue. The retention strap assemblies, retention strap bolts, tip weights, pitch horn clevis, pitch horns of both main rotor blades must be replaced at 1,500 hours. Refer to the construction manual and video, section 24, main rotor blades, when constructing new replacement blades and parts. After performing the 1,000-hour service on your helicopter, it is a good and safe practice to perform an inspection similar to the new aircraft inspection. Using the same checklist to verify and check all of the alignments and riggings will allow you to double-check everything. It is also a good practice to tie the helicopter down for its first run-ups after servicing the main rotor blades, hub, and swash plate. This concludes the 1,000-hour service and the maintenance video series. Remember to include the 25, 50, 100, 250, and 500-hour service procedures with the 1,000-hour interval.